I think it's helpful to look at data and to look at benchmarks just to get a sense of, okay, but it always should be in service of what is it we're trying to solve for. Yeah. Are your people underworked? Well, if you're looking at, I guess, or overworked, I could say one's overworked. Yeah. If they're overworked, you're going, okay, what's the right number of employees to have? Maybe that's not a problem. Maybe they don't have the right tools, and that's why they're overworked. So you really need, benchmarking is part of the tools. Yeah. But I do think it's an interesting conversation, and it's great to see this because I think it's a fundamental part of how HR does their job and something we are involved in. But at the same time, I think it is just a wonderful conversation to talk about the limitations of that being your sole approach.
Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome, everyone, to Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. And today we are joining you from the UKG Analyst Day, right?
Hey, everyone. I'm so excited to be a little bit on the podcast. I'm Jason Zappa. I lead the portfolio marketing here at Analyst Relations at UKG. I'm so happy to have the Sapient team here with us. I hope we have a wonderful podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to break down the news you need to know and help you make sense of what it means to be in our industry and how it can impact your organization. And we're going to continue to make sure that you guys know what day we're actually talking about today. We're in May already. How did we get into May, Cliff? Right. So Cliff and I are on site and we're doing this live. So you guys will build a couple of but we're on May 22nd already, which means that we're just about a month away from my granddaughter's birthday, which means I need to be buying some birthday gifts. But outside of that, everyone, I'm your host, Stacey Harris, the Chief Research Officer for Sapient Insights Group and Managing Partner. And we are a research and advisory firm. And joining me today, as usual, is my wonderful Director of Research, Cliff Stevenson, and Principal Analyst for Sapient Insights Group, and our guest speaker, Jason did a little jump in. Cliff, there's a lot going on. The tea is rolling hot this week. Some of it because we're at the UKG Analyst Day, and we're doing this live. Some of it because there's some news going on in the legal world this week that we're going to have to talk a little bit about. So it's going to be a hot episode. What else are we going to be talking about this week, Cliff?
Well, I noticed on the LinkedIn post that you had promoting this, you mentioned we don't just talk about AI. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of AI. So whether you consider that a good or bad thing, there's going to be a lot of AI news, a lot of discussions. Rippling will be mentioned, but for once, it's got nothing to do with deal. There's just some industry stuff going on.
And yes, as Stacey mentioned, we are in the same room for the first time. We did want to kind of keep that little split screen going on. So if you see either of us kind of looking, we're actually looking at each other. But you can get a sense for us here in beautiful Fort Lauderdale at the Four Seasons. So this doesn't help at all. This conversation, you're like, oh, the English job must be so nice. It works.
I tell you, when we're traveling from city to city, but I will say there are times when we get a nice hotel or we get a nice location to stay. I won't complain. The beds are really nice. The Four Seasons. That's what I'll say.
And we're going to start off talking about events and ones we've been to, giving you the listener,
viewer, we're also on YouTube, and the chance to kind of hear all of the new announcements, anything that we're allowed to talk about, directions these companies are going, as well as any of the sort of news that's been happening. There's no slowdown of any news.
Yeah, it doesn't stop at all. And so you will be seeing us at some upcoming events. So both Cliff and I will be actually next week already going to Cornerstone Spark event. That'll be May 27th to 29th. I'll be speaking at the executive session that they have there. I think I'm going to be on the main stage too with Himanshu and talking a little bit about their strategy and where they're heading. So excited to be able to be on that panel. We will then I'll be at ISOL Connect in Chicago June 3rd and 4th. And if you are in the Chicago area and are interested in joining, come on down. We have a great new report that we're launching at that event on leveling the HR playing field. And I'm going to tell you, there's some cool stats and data that we're pulling out of the research about how things are different depending on your age and your gender, and just a lot of really interesting information about how HR is perceived and what's changing inside of organizations and what you can do to maybe address some of the challenges that organizations have. One of the big things I'll be talking about is is what is the different views inside of organizations between finance, HR, CIOs, those kind of things. So it's going to be a great event. So we really, really want to recommend that you join. Also, we will be doing a LinkedIn Live session. If you do miss that, Leveling Up HR, that will be the following week. And then we're going to be doing another connective event and a sales kickoff meeting, right? That you'll be going to, Cliff, correct, for iSolved?
That's right. It will be in 2 different locations. So I'll be really, traveling around the beautiful city of Las Vegas, talking to both partners and then, the sales kickoff that they're doing, talking about, basically the voice of the customer, taking what we learned from you, those that take the survey. As we've mentioned before, this is how your voice gets elevated to the top decision makers so they can really understand the needs of the market. So I'm very excited to do those events. I love seeing this sort of full cycle come through, right? We start, as we do now, have the survey in the field, and then it gets in, we process all that data, we have the large data sets, we also have the comments, then it goes on to companies. They use that to say, okay, this is what the market needs, this is what's working, this is what isn't working. Now let's go, and now goes all the way through to promoting it, letting people know, here's the changes we've made. Very cool.
Yeah. And then we do have a couple other events that we're still working on. So we will probably be out in the field a little bit more in September and in August, but we don't have them all booked yet. So we will let you know more about that. But we just got the announcement of our mega session time and date at HR Tech. So just a big shout out if you are going to the HR Tech conference in Las Vegas, put on by HR Executive Magazine, week of September 15th through 18th. Be sure you keep there through Thursday. We are Thursday morning mega session. If you want to know all the inside details, that's the true spilling the tea event, because nobody gets those details until they go to that session. It will be the earliest that you can get data from our report. And for those who have attended that before, you should probably know that we do say things in that session that don't get put into the report because sometimes the data needs some more explanation. And we also don't oftentimes put that into the webinars that we do. So if you want to get the live in-person conversation, that's the place to get it. And that will be Thursday morning at 8 a.m. I realize it's going to be a late night for everybody, but set your alarms. All right. Also, just so everyone is aware, as Cliff said, the survey is out. It is available. We have, I think, about 2,000 responses already, but we're really seeing the numbers increase pretty rapidly. I think everybody's interested in seeing what's happening in the market. So if you're depending on that from a benchmarking perspective this year, you are really going to get some solid data, but please make sure you participate because that's when you're going to get the most out of it. So that is in the link. We'll have those links in the commentary when we put everything out today. But Cliff, outside of all of that, there is some news going on. One is you just came back from an event last week with Susan Richards, our founder. Can you talk a little bit about that? That was Workhuman, wasn't it?
That was Workhuman. They always put on a fantastic event, which makes sense considering their core is employee recognition. Now, they are making a very deliberate attempt to sort of move beyond that, right? They don't want to be thought of as rewards and recognition only. Obviously, that is how they gather that data, but they, just like everyone else, realize the power of data. Not saying we haven't been talking about that for years, but good to see people really using that. So they're saying, okay, we can do all of this, we can gather all this information. We can also look at things like network analysis. We can find future leaders, and get tapped into that. Their CEO, Eric Mosley, must have said data 7 or 8 times or more in his keynote, which was really neat. And I got a chance to talk to him about that, and he really sees that as a way forward. They've also started partnering with other organizations. UKG was there because if you think about the Great Place to Work product offering,
They're saying, okay, well, how do we tie that in? We could see those that receive recognition also, right? To kind of get that. They also have been working with Perceptics, another one that gathers employee information is in that talent intelligence space, as well as Wall Street Journal. That was one of the big announcements they made that they're going to do a chief people officer sort of consortium council in partnership with.
Yeah, and I saw the announcement for that. They've already had some pretty good people in the market. I'm interested to hear how that works, I think, right? Because I do think we're seeing a little bit, and I don't know how to better explain this, but a lot of the traditional big HR firms are stepping back a little bit and really shifting into gear to speak to CFOs and CIOs and CXOs and other positions. I really do think at this point in time, we need to double down on the voice of the CHRO as we're talking about what's happening in the market. So I was glad to hear that they're doing that at WorkHuman. And then we also know that you've got a chance to see Trevor Noah, right? Any comments from him?
You know what? I did not. That was on Susan's watch. I was there the first
commentary.
3 days, and we'll have to see what she thought. But I will say, having Susan there is kind of her first time being at this type of conference. She leads up all of our leadership practices and change management and adaptive change, all of that. So kind of seeing this direct one was wonderful. She took to it like fish to water. Immediately was making friends. I think actually when I left, it was about an hour before Trevor was going on, and I saw her just walking arm in arm, with Aaron McClintock, who's leading their product marketing. And I was like, that was really wonderful to see. And there was just a lot of talk. It was nice to talk to a lot of the end users there too, right? The actual people using these ed systems across the board. And that's another way WorkHuman sort of differentiates in their conference, is that they have a lot of people who aren't already on the system, potentials.
Yeah.
And so they were often saying, okay, well, how do I use this? And so they really focused on use cases a lot. They had Kelly Jones from Cisco, the electronics one, not the food one, and Carrie Dryberg from BP. They were both, very large companies, and talking about how they use that information and all that data combined with other types of data to help inform business strategy and business decisions, and also to see if systems are working, right?
Yeah.
It's a good way to check to see if whether that's learning, or if you're upskilling or you're trying to bring in skills from another way, do I see those skills, those terms being used? Like I saw them, being more inclusive in their language. They see that written, and then they can use AI to sort of parse all of that and say, okay, this word comes up a lot, and so we know that it's having an effect whatever intervention we may have done.
Well, we're going to start to see, I think, a lot more of that sort of semantic analysis, right, as organizations are going through that. And I think that's going to be a really, it's going to be an opportunity for AI to see how well AI understands sort of not just what they're reading and what we write in and type in, but also what they're hearing, right? And that'll be a good next step. We also have another one of our member executive leaders, Terry Zipper, who's our CEO, who was speaking at the Total Rewards World at Work event in Florida, your hometown, right? She's here she's up there in Orlando while we're down here. And she said that event was really, really great, because not only was there a lot of people talking about the conversation of pay transparency and pay equity and just how we think about compensation in this new market that we're in, and how AI is going to play a role in that compensation conversation from a transparency perspective. But she said that what she really found engaging when she was there is that the audience was just hungry for data. A lot of conversations about data. They want to understand how best to manage this inside their organizations, because what we're seeing in the market is that as we get more transparent with pay, people are thinking differently about total rewards and compensation, and what else goes into it along with benefits, and what else goes into it along with the flexibility you want at work or the ability to work at home. And so it's changing the dynamics of the benefits and the total rewards conversation. So very excited about that.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's interesting, right? The one conference we're at was about recognition and employee engagement, talent intelligence, employee experience. The other one, compensation management. What's the underlying theme? Data. How are we using this, data going forward, right? It's AI is a conversation, right? But it always is relying on data. Right. There's just nothing else.
AI is only as good as the data behind it. We've all been talking about that. That's why you and I talked a lot about it. Now, granted, there is some new stuff coming out in the market on, especially with quantum physics and some of this other stuff, right? Or quantum computing, sorry, just say about, can we use data in different ways? Can we use less data to make better predictions? I think those are conversations we're probably going to get into, but I still think that we've got, even with less data, that it means even more likely it has to be high quality data, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and then we should talk a little bit about today, what we saw already. We're only halfway through the day, so there's a lot more. We didn't get into quite as much on the product. We got a chance to meet Suresh, who is the new head of product, which I have not had a chance to meet, and he was really amazing. Jennifer Morgan kicked off the day. She is the CEO, and I really enjoyed her enthusiasm, her conversation about culture. As we all know, I mean, the Ultimate and the Chronos combination had very different cultures. And there was very clear that she's trying to build a one culture kind of model, right? They're bringing in people from a lot of different organizations. She was very upfront mentioning how their change in what they're talking about is going to be having, I think, they understand that there were things that happened during the layoff. They understand that there are things that are happened during the merger that caused impact on customer service. She was really upfront with that. I love that. And so, because I think there's a lot to be said about understanding where you're starting and what you're trying to go to, right? And that was the story that I heard from her on the culture conversation. The other thing that we saw really clearly in the conversation we just had with both Rachel and Bob was customer conversation all the way through, understanding where the customers are at, making sure they capture them not just through the sales cycle, but they take that information and move it right into how they implement the systems, and they're not having to repeat themselves. That's a big win. I know that seems like a very simple thing that a customer goes through sales and then they go through getting, implemented, and that they might have to repeat themselves. But I can tell you, customers hate that. And so just fixing some of those things really make a big difference. What did you hear, Cliff, that really impressed you this morning?
Obviously the same. I was sitting, behind you, but yeah, and the chairman is Bob DePont, who's the Chief Customer Experience Officer, which again, there's a lot of new faces. I mean, Bob's not super new compared to some that we saw that were only about 3 months here or so. But you can see from the hirings, the focuses that they're going towards, right? And Bob's, laser focused on that. So, and you mentioned the sort of the upfront and the honesty that we heard. I think there was, somewhat challenging questions from the analysts and media that are here, saying, would you say then that before you were reactive and now you're proactive? And I think she said, yes, she was very honest with this, is that we're moving into this mode because we don't want to find that we have customer problems. We want to anticipate what goes to. It's almost what you're talking about, using data from firms like ours and others, saying, and just directly talking to their customers. What are you seeing? Let's solve problems before they arise. What are you planning to do in the future, and how can we best support that, right? This is very much something that has come up tangentially a lot when we talk about AI, which I know will be a large topic, which is not just sticking AI onto things because you need to have it, but figuring out what are the problems, what's the best way to solve it. Maybe AI, it may be through new people, maybe new processes. So that sort of forward-thinking leadership, I think, is going to serve UKG well, in my opinion. And I like how open it were. There was some NDA stuff, but the general gist of what we're getting across is that they see all of the different ways that they can support all sorts of different customers, especially now into more global payroll. Right? They have their one view that they talked about quite a bit, which supports a lot of that. Trying to get a handle on a bunch of different complex payrolls, which is, Stacey, well.
It's the number one crux for a lot of organizations, right? Like they could be doing everything else in their organization right, but payroll's got to be perfect, right? Like that's the biggest issue. I really like the one view conversation. I think, the three things I heard loudest from Jennifer was that they are one team working together, right? That was the conversation for the UK brand. The customers are at the center of the conversation. And what I really liked is how they didn't just talk about customers as in a customer who bought, but all the individual employees in the organization. So they're kind of really focusing in on being the tool for the workplace, right? And that was interesting because I think we've heard similar versions at some other organizations, but I think they're really focusing heavily on that frontline worker and all the positions in that frontline worker, not just the HRIS or the head manager or the chief HR officer, but the person, the barista making the coffee and the person designing a widget and the person on the ground actually building the widget, right? Like that was really, really clear in what they were talking about. Jen also did mention, we have to be very clear that Jennifer Morgan had worked at BlackRock for many years. She is a very sound business person and understands what it takes to lead a global organization. And that was definitely a lot of what we heard was that they are focusing on execution now. But she did mention double-digit growth. And that was the first time I've heard them put that stake in the ground that way, that loud. Those were her three big things. And I think that every other vendor in the market should be paying attention to that because I don't know that oftentimes I think everybody feels like UKG is maybe for small businesses or mid-market, but they're not for those big global companies. There's no way to do double-digit growth unless you're going for big global companies. And so I think that's what we're going to see a lot of. AI first, like you said, has been all over the conversation here. Suresh is definitely doubling down on that as well in his new role. And then we heard a lot about partnerships too. So my expectation, we're going to see some more partnership growth here too. So early days for a lot of them. I mean, we heard a lot of it. Like, I've been enrolled for 4 months. I've been enrolled for 6 months. I've been enrolled for 10 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a great opportunity for us to get to know this leadership team as they're rolling into these new roles. I'm excited about what we'll see next year, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should also, we'd be remiss if we didn't give a shout out to the wonderful Jen Braffman.
Yes.
Who I think that Jason, who you saw, Jason Salvo earlier, said that she was going to be very jealous because he was on and she didn't get the shout out. But so I have to give her a shout out. Keep the kids from fighting.
I will say, as analyst events go, and we go to a lot of these, and yes, we always want to be treated nice, but what was nice is there was clear communications up front. We knew exactly what we were doing, what the day was going to look like. That sometimes is the most important thing for us when we're doing these events. When we got into our rooms, there was a little bit of food. That's always nice when you're traveling a long distance. Not quite as far for me as for some others, but I can't imagine how many times I can roll into a room and I can't get room service or I can't get anything, and you're got to kind of wait till the next day. So that was a real positive for me, just the little things. And then opportunities just to have real, informal conversations. They've created a lot of that. Not overly scripted. I mean, I know there's a lot of scripting still being done, but not as overly scripted as sometimes we see at other events. So those are kind of the big benefits. And I think Jen's done a really nice job kind of building an environment for that. So yeah, kudos out to her and the work that she's doing here. It's really showing off. So
yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention as well, because I think we've been talking about global payroll and a lot of the big systems.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this isn't just sort of UKG going up. They're actually putting some focus on small businesses as well.
Mm-hmm.
I had across me at dinner last night was it Brent? I apologize. It's Brent LeBath, I believe.
Yeah.
And he's actually one of their go-to-market leaders and also brand new, and is tasked with sort of, looking at what the SMB community really needs, what there are specific needs for, and working with them. So we had to talk about, some of the data that we could use to support that and help them. So, don't feel left out. Don't think that if you're a small business,
you're not going to get
focusing on different directions at the same time.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, it was a very nice and natural conversation. We weren't forced to talk about small businesses. It just happens to be something both of us are very passionate about.
Yeah. Small businesses are definitely, if you're going to do growth here in the United States, that's the market that's still growing, right? Big companies there is always 15 to 20% changeover in HR systems, right? We did analysis earlier this year that showed that the vendor number is about 29 right now, not modules. Modules is at about 26, but the number of vendors you have is at about 29 vendors on average. And then we see that on average, organizations are replacing 4 systems a year. Now, could be big, could be little, but they're replacing 4 systems a year. That was the first time we were able to sort of get to that data. And I'm like, oh, that's you're always in buying mode, no matter where you're at in the HR space right now, right? So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I want to, if we can, I know that as always, if you're a regular listener, regular viewer of the show, you know that these episodes get longer and we don't want to cut anything out.
Yeah.
Just like our annual HR systems survey report gets longer every year, it's certainly not due to bloat. We're actually streamlining it. It's hard to believe. But there's just more and more interesting things to talk about that nothing really should be left aside, right?
Yeah.
They're all children. They're all your children, and we love them all. So I want to, if we can, just do a quick recap of some stories that we just didn't have time for last episode. So one is just so interesting because I just came, and I think I just mentioned, just coming from WorkHuman, this idea of organizational network analysis. Yeah. We have touched on it before, but it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm going to mention it. I've seen it. But just like how large language models existed and other things exist, they just didn't seem to come into their own. I would say O&A is having its moment, organizational network analysis. It's really starting to be used. I was hearing it front main stage at WorkHuman. There was a great post, Greg Pryor, along with, I believe he had a co-writer. Yes, Kristen Cullen-Lester. Mm-hmm. Lester together wrote a book, The Social Capital Imperative, Revealing, Developing, and Leveraging Organizational Networks, and just talking about how there's already a number of use cases in place. If you're not familiar, I think this is where we're going to see the intersection of AI. I think maybe that's why it hadn't come into its own. It could be used, but it required some there wasn't really specialized technologies, or if they were too specialized, right? Now we can say AI going, look at all of the conversations that are happening through emails, through maybe your recognition platform, through payroll, any sort of messaging that's happening, going, here are the people that seem to be the centers of information, and here are the people that all the questions seem to go to them, and all these sort of things. So you can look at that and see it visually, right? And you see this is the type of language that's used in these areas, right? Which is sentiment analysis.
It's really interesting because I think you hit it right on, Cliff. O&I, we've seen it a lot. I mean, definitely people analytics roles. You go to those events. I can remember when I went to Australia in 2019, I think I would say it was Mars or it might have been one of the sort of candy makers, I believe, had done this. I had gotten a chance to meet the lady who was heading up their O&A model that they were doing, because they were all disparate islands, right? And so they were kind of looking at, in the island environment where their workers were at, how all the connections were taking place with communications, right? And so it was fascinating to look at sort of regional and O&A and communications and how that worked out. And then they were rolling that into some succession conversations, right? I think very much like skills management, O&A is that similar kind of always complex, really hard to do manually, or even with just basic algorithms. I think, yes, AI is going to make that more viable. And so I'm not surprised that we've got more conversations happening. It's getting more front stage. I think just like the skills management conversation is, we're finally getting the tools that will keep the maintenance of that kind of conversation going. It's you do it once and you're like, oh, look how much information, but it's the maintenance and the upkeep and the kind of constant review of it, because it's about what it changes to, not just where it is, right? And so I'm excited to see it get its day in the limelight. It'll be interesting to see, if it starts to get rolled into things like workforce planning, or if it starts to get rolled into things like scheduling, like that would be very interesting to see. So place to watch, pin holder on that one, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the comment you said, it's about where it's going, not just where it is right now. That relates to another article that I thought was just so useful. And it's going to sound a little interesting, listeners, viewers, because it almost seems like it's challenging our core
business
beliefs, right?
It's okay.
But the title of this post was, "Are External Benchmarks Hurting Your Employee Experience Strategy?" And a lot of what they were talking about was about, you've got this data, and we all know that HR, and I'm not picking on HR, we're both HR people, loves to sort of follow the leader, right? Am I doing the right thing? I mean, we all want to do that, regardless of what our job is, right? But it reminds me a lot of something Stacey has sort of been repeating over the years, is that there's too much reliance on best practices. The term best practice, meaning this is what everybody else is doing, right? The classic sort of mom example of all your friends can jump off the bridge, but you do that too.
Yeah.
But that's what benchmarking is. And you're going, Cliff, that sounds very strange. Isn't that what you do? But when you look at what the sort of counterpoints were to this idea, he's talking about, you're probably relying on too small of numbers. That's something we're very cognizant of. We're not trying to brag when we're saying we have the largest data set. We're trying to, so you can trust it, because it's not a small number. It's not, okay, well, 6 people are doing this. I remember in the early days of Google, everyone's like, well, Google does that. And I was like, that's just one example. And, that's probably not causation, it's by correlation that they serve free lunches. I mean, I'm all down for free lunches. But other things like, older, and relying on old and outdated things, right? That doesn't make sense. That, that you're comparing apples to oranges. All of these sort of mistakes can be made when you're using benchmarking. But again, it should never be like, even if you have the wonderful data, it's again how you use it. Like, okay, well, companies our size have this many people. No, that's not hopeful. Yeah, I know people are trying to make decisions in more or less a vacuum, but again, just like we were talking about how you sort of companies are deploying AI. They're looking at future issues and they're figuring out, is this a tool that would be useful for this? I think it's helpful to look at data and to look at benchmarks just to get a sense of, okay, but it always should be in service of what is it we're trying to solve for. Yeah. Are your people underworked? Well, if you're looking at, or overworked, I could say one's overworked. Yeah. If they're overworked, you're going, okay, what's the right number of employees to have? Maybe that's not a problem. Maybe they don't have the right tools, and that's why they're overworked. So you really need, benchmarking is part of the tools. Yeah. But I do think it's an interesting conversation, and it's great to see this, because I think it's a fundamental part of how HR does their job and something we are involved in. But at the same time, I think it is just a wonderful conversation to talk about the limitations of that being your sole approach.
Yeah, and I really liked this article for two reasons. I agree with you on all the things that you've said, Cliff, and I think the opportunity here is to really think about benchmarking as the start of the conversation versus the end of the conversation, right? Like you're not trying to goal to it, but it gives you a place to have questions if you didn't have any questions previously. I think the other thing though is that as we move more towards AI, is realizing that this big conversation that AI is going to take all the HR roles, and no, let me just say that I'm going to go counter completely against all the two big analysts who are saying this. AI is not going to take all the HR roles. We're not going to get rid of them. What it is going to do is it might shift what you do in your roles. And I think we all understand that. And what I would say is that when you depend heavily on data and that data informs the AI, what you could end up with is a situation where the AI is kind of running on a constant expectation or understanding of what historically other organizations like you and your size or your have done. And it's not allowing you to have enough uniqueness about you as a company. And so this is where I always say, when you're thinking about what you want to do as an organization, you've got to understand your own DNA. You've got to understand your own people, their own skills, their own capabilities. And so you don't want to have everything sort of tailored too much towards whatever the rest of the market is doing. I think the Moderna conversation is a perfect example of this. We'll probably get into it. I think you probably got it on the list here. Yeah. But everybody's been talking about Moderna's combining their CHRO and their IT head underneath a single person with the idea that they will oversee both AI agents and the workforce and how that's working together. That makes a lot of sense for Moderna and for the backgrounds, the experience of the people inside that organization. That may not make any sense for you as an organization, depending on where you're starting and what you're doing. And so even if 30% of the market moves that way, doesn't mean it makes sense for you. And so that's my big takeaway on all that, is to really understand your own organization and put everything in context, right?
Yeah, and let's talk about that Moderna one. I mean, we're already here. Yeah. A little expansion of the story. If you didn't see it, I think it was probably one of the bigger news stories in terms of what I could see from the amount of people making comments on it, posting about it on LinkedIn.
I think Anita, who put out a comment, I got like 500 comments and likes. She's like, it's like it just blew up. Yeah, it's
Anita Latink, who we've mentioned and often linked to before. Wonderful friend. Yeah, so Moderna basically created a new role, which is a chief people and digital technology officer. Which we've seen before. We have seen this. Now, one thing that I thought was very interesting about particularly the Moderna story that I didn't think get enough press is that person who took over that role was just the CHRO, meaning they went HR and took over data, not the other way around, which we've seen before, where someone's like, okay, I've got all this tech expertise, and I'm like, well, then you can handle the people, right? It shows the importance that the elevation of HR's strategic role, which we've seen over and over, still not as much as it should be, but I think this might be the sort of, I don't want to say canary in a coal mine because it's a negative issue, but like whatever the positive version of that is, right? A harbinger of things to come that are all very good, as that becomes part of it. But yes, that was kind of the big impact because it's, yes, the agentic model, but also just that there's such a fusion now of how people are doing their jobs. We've talked before about how people tech is just becoming work tech. Yep. And those lines are getting blurrier. And I think Moderna is kind of looking at that. But again, for their industry and for what they do, it makes total sense. I don't think there are certain types of jobs, and we're going to be talking a lot about how AI affects different jobs and things. There's certain jobs where it just wouldn't make sense. I think a lot of the retail and things, they're not going to be the person who's handling the information transfer and payments and the point of sale systems is not going to be the same person who's in charge of figuring out where the right people are to man 7,000 stores globally.
Yes, having worked in retail and having our CHO come from operations would say that's probably not going to work for them at all. But here's my take on this whole story. And what I think that we've got to really think about is it's not about do those roles need to be combined or not. Again, it's very specific to the organization, to the capabilities, to what you have within the organization. What I do think that we have to think about in HR is, and this is every CEO is going to have this conversation, which is an agent viewed in our world as a additional workforce entity? or is it viewed as a technology enabling our workforce? And I think every organization is taking different stances on this. And I think that is going to have to be the conversation of the executive leadership and involving CHROs and involving IT and everyone. But I think once they figure that out, then the path becomes clear as to where they should have these conversations, where agents should be housed, what agents should be, how agents should be developed. And I think then on top of that, they're going to have to watch carefully what governments are doing around this, because at a certain point, we may find that if an organization is sort of considering that an agent is equivalent to a work entity, a part-time worker, a full-time worker, right? If it's equivalent to a work entity, there may end up being taxes around that then, right? There's a performance and a tax, because this is how our governments make money on tax, right? Like you have to understand where the money flows from, right? And if salaries are being challenged, and if compensation is being sort of done in different ways, then that will be the conversation also coming from the governments, which is how much do I tax the fact that you've got productivity with technology? Now, that's a far reach, but it is already in a lot of the zeitgeist. A lot of the conversations are happening around that. If, on the other words, you're looking at it as an enablement tool, then you're going to be a little farther away. You're going to have a little more room to manage on that conversation, because that's just like any other tool that we have in our toolkit to get things done. So I do think this is going to, IBM's whole, I cut all my HR staff, right, and just directly went to recruiting and hiring through the managers. There's a conversation to be had there about, okay, if they're doing the work and productivity, how do you ensure they have the right privacy, the right security, the right ethical standards?
Mm-hmm.
How do you make sure that and we're going to get into the conversation on Workday, how do you make sure that the biases aren't there, right? Then you have to handle that and you have to manage that. And that's going to be a conversation about a workforce, not a technology, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned the IBM story, because that was another one of the news ones that was going around this week. The CEO of IBM, Arvind Krishna, said that actually led to more hiring.
Yes.
Overall. Now, this is just their own report. You can see why they would want to say that. But interestingly enough, a lot of, I thought, the kind of work that was being done, it's interesting because, again, it's, they say, okay, well, we're hiring in like programming and sales, but it's like, who's doing the hiring exactly?
Well, and the whole point is that it was all running through they were not running them through the HR staff like they used to. It was all running through agents and being managed through agents, right?
Right.
That was the conversation. But again, we just had that. There's a lot of things that we haven't got right yet in this. And so, IBM's a big company. The whole saying goes, you never got fired for hiring IBM, right? So, we'll wait and see, right?
Yeah, I do think it's just a possibility that, yes, there is some of that work being done, but okay, you probably have people doing these roles. It's just that the roles have shifted. There was a really wonderful article that we'll definitely need to get to, talking about looking at AI fundamentally different. It was interesting because I really like this article, and I will get to it. I don't want to skip ahead because we do have some news.
We got like 10 minutes, so just giving you a warning on our time. So sorry, audience, we are a little time today. So
okay, so we'll get to that because it's a very deep conversation. It was the one that was about you shouldn't use the phrase AI is going to take your job. Those people that can use AI take a job, which is probably something I've said, and it's like no, you're thinking about it all wrong. And it's interesting. If we don't have time, I'll link to it.
Yeah,
but. Here's a few news stories, and one, it's an update to one that was a big story last week. And if the story I'm referring to is that the Office of Personnel Management, basically HR for the United States, had given Workday a contract. And there was controversy, might not be the right word, but there was a little bit of a kerfuffle about didn't they go through the normal bidding process, or lots of different organizations talked to it? Well, it looks like they have canceled that award. It looks like between a bunch of other initiatives that have come out, between maybe some of legal issues about that, they've walked that back. So if you heard it last week, we mentioned it, like, maybe it's this reason, Workday would sort of integrate nicely. But, it's not saying that they're not going to use them, but they're not just going to award it or done.
Award it right out. Yeah, it isn't a single sole source, as they called it, award for their HR system. And that was a pretty big win. Again, they might still get it, right? Like, so that's gonna, we'll kind of be watching that, but it's worth noting that there was enough pushback, enough conversation, enough kind of reprioritization on that they adjusted that thinking, which we're seeing a little bit of right now in the U.S. government, kind of going forward, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. So we'll see see where that goes. But there's other Workday news today as well, right, Cliff?
The other Workday news. Oh, yeah. I was like,
Wait a minute.
yeah. Go ahead. I'll that one because we're talking some. I don't even know. I think I've used the term boiling hot tea. I think this is still being steeped, to use the analogy on that one. That was just a few hours ago. This is the one you referred to.
Literally like 4 hours ago, right? Yeah. And so just to kind of, I've got to find the notes on it. Did you throw it at the end of the article? Or?
I don't know if it's in the notes. That's why if you saw my sort of panicked look, viewers, I got away with it for just the podcast listeners.
Just for a moment. All right. So let me just make sure, because I don't want to misquote this. I want to make sure that we have that conversation. Why don't you go on to the next one?
Yep.
And then I'll come back to this topic.
Yeah,
so you guys see in real life kind of how we make the sausage here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think we got a compliment on our chemistry, which I thought was nice, but now you can see it, it's like how we do it. And thank you for all the listeners who have ever given us the compliments. We do hear those comments and love that. But mentioned, I was going to have to talk about Rippling, but it's all good. Rippling had an increased valuation, up to 16.8 billion valued, and raised another 450 million. So, maybe it's just one of those cases of no press is bad press or something of that nature. Parker Conrad, while discussing this in the panel, mentioned that there was no sort of single lead investors coming from a number of different sources. So people are really seeing some value there too. And what's interesting and sort of ties into the conversation we had earlier is that one of Rippling's sort of USPs, maybe not a true USP, but at least a strength of theirs, is their ability to sort of tie in IT services and help and technology. So, as we talk about that integration between HR and IT, the company that sort of leads with that is increasing in valuation. So clearly the market sees something there.
And we're definitely seeing more investment from smaller or mid-market HR solutions in that finance and IT space. We saw Paylocity go there. We just got a conversation going with HiBob with their recent acquisition of Mosaic. This is a space I think we're going to see more bleeding of the lines. I wouldn't be surprised. We didn't get any data here on UKG, but just listening to how they're talking about their platform, that we're not going to see a broadening of what it means to be a workforce technology, right? Because it is about touching people, getting things done for people, and you're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, and then I think the other conversation that we have there is that there's no other updates on the lawsuit at this point, right? We don't have any more boiling tea on that one.
Not that I know of. Yeah, I know that we had some fleeing to foreign countries and some other sort of shenanigans that happened before. And I really do. I don't want to make light of it because certainly there's some serious business going on here. But I think if I do have to find a silver lining, it's like I said, it doesn't seem to hurt. Yeah. It seems to be more or less, I'm not seeing big layoffs. There's not anything being closed. There might be, hopefully it's just maybe a few bad actors, regardless of how this thing lands, and isn't reflective at all of like sort of business practices would affect the end user. Yeah. Right. That's
what we'll be watching for is the impact on the end user, because it's a big issue. But speaking of impacts on the end user, and I don't know if this is going to have a big impact, but we did just get the announcement. For those of you who've been watching the sort of the Workday lawsuit over hiring practices, it's been going on for at least a year, could be more than that, right? At this point, it was a lawsuit alleging that the job applicant screening technology is discriminatory, and it was brought forward by Derek Mobley, who sued the human resource software company, saying that he'd been rejected by about 100 jobs. Now, there was very clear when this came out at first point that the leadership of Workday, one of all, they were doing everything they could to sort of abide by whatever regulations, standards, tools that they had put in place. But there was also commentary that at a certain point, it's a technology, and you have to put some of that level of conversation or blame, if you want to call blame, on the hiring professionals and the businesses that are doing the hiring, because it's how they're using that tool, right? And so there was an expectation, I think, in the market that this was going to be just basically canceled, that they would get this dismissed. And what we just found out about 5 hours ago, it might have been at this point, right, is that the judge who was overseeing this, Judge Rita Lynn's Friday preliminary order, will allow the case to proceed as a collective action suit, similar to a class action suit. Now, again, that does not mean that Workday will be found, whatever's the word, guilty in this. And we will defer to Heather Busing on this one, and maybe we'll get her on the show to talk about it, because I don't know all of the legal terms on this. But I do think it's important to note that if this goes forward, and if it ends up becoming that there is some liability on the technology firm's part, that will open up the floodgates for a lot of these other, because it is by no means, because Workday was one of the more conservative organizations on this front, right? So there were a lot of other organizations, I think, who were less conservative in how they were handling technology and how they were handling some of the bias tools and their ability. That, I think, is going to open up some floodgates across other technologies in this market. So as everybody's watching this, I know there's always the oh, it's a big company, they're going to be able to sort of get it out of court. It does seem like this is moving forward and that we are going to hear some more news about it. And so I think it's something to watch. And as buyers are thinking about this, it does not mean that any of the applications are having the challenges. I think they just have to make decisions about how do they use AI? How do they use algorithms? How do they use the data? How do they make sure they have humans continue to be involved in the process, right?
Yeah, it'll definitely be worth watching. One of the other stories that had come out, or not a story, but one of the things we were going to talk about is Glider HR, who launched AI agents as interviewers, meaning fully, not just agents. We usually talk about that. We mean sort of behind the scenes, the ones that are collecting information. They really mean a sort of personification, someone you visually see.
The little star on the screen is literally interviewing you. That's what that was the example they showed, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, this has been one that definitely got some pushback, although not from theirs. But there were other stories. I think Wired had one and a few others talking about people's experiences that come out. And it's almost universally negative. I think there was some data that something like, and this was from a totally different company that was running these ones, 43% of Americans would not feel comfortable being interviewed by job for AI. And there was, the thing when certain tech works, and I believe this is used this term, he's like, there are certain systems that work great when they're working, but they fail spectacularly, meaning like when it goes bad, it's really bad. And you're looking for something, and I always just call it risk reward, right? And when something like this happens and it is a fail, when we see AI making suggestions that are harmful to somebody or could be potentially harmful, that sort of failure is so bad that it sort of overrides almost anything else that can be done, right? So it's interesting. Again, there's so many possible values you can see, just truly getting rid of any sort of bias would be wonderful. But then it all comes down to what is the AI trained on. Right?
It really does. And I mean, and I think, and just to kind of close off this whole conversation, right? Workday's commentary to this whole thing is that in the court filing is that they're opposing the lawsuit's allegations. It claims that it does not screen prospective employees for customers, that its technology does not make hiring decisions. They do have the hired scored in there now, AI, but the hired score would have been prior to the lawsuit with the acquisition of that. And so I think that it is this merging of the issues of what does AI really do or not do, right? And is the technology the responsibility of the vendor, or is the technology the responsibility of the buyer? Kind of like, if the car has a problem, is the driver who's the problem, or is it the car manufacturer? And it depends on where you fall on that line sometimes, right? And so we're gonna see more of that. We have just 5 minutes to wrap up. What else do we want to get to, Cliff, before we go?
What I'd like to do, because we've been talking a lot about technology, and we just mentioned how important people are. So I'm going to run down some people news really quickly, and then we can have a conversation about all of these big topics either next time or listener viewers, find us on LinkedIn, find where we've made these posts. Drop the comments in, we will reply. We always do. I can't think we've ever left anyone dry. You want to talk about this, you've seen some stories, let us know. Let's continue this conversation. Let's make conversation between all of us. But let me give you some people news, because it's just really exciting when some of these things happen. And at the end of the day, it's the people that matter, right? So speaking of Workday, they've hired, and I might be mispronouncing his last name, but I believe it's Bayless. It's Bailis, so it might be Bayless, but he is joining Workday as their Chief Technology Officer. He was at Google. He's also a current professor of computer science at Stanford. So shout out to my cousin. Beat me by 10 points with Jerry. So Moss Towns, there's a shout out. But so he is, clearly, really tapped into what's happening right now, what's going on, and would be a good person to lead over there. And, very, very bright guy. Mike Earl is joining Lumity, and Lumity does sort of fits, I guess, just enhancements, right? It helps you see your portfolio, it helps understand the differences, helps work with people to sort of increase the value of that. We also see movement to Don Weinstein is joining Finch as an advisor. We knew Don from his days at ADP.
Yeah, that was an interesting one, and Finch is kind of watching what they're doing with that. I'm interested in how many of these people that we know have been in the market, and Don led the strategy for ADP technology for a very long time. How they're shifting into these sort of tangential areas of HR, right? That don't always show up the way we would think would be an HR system, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, those are all, those are the big sort of people news. We mentioned rippling, but a lot of discussion on AI and how it's used. I'm going to put all these links into the show notes as well as on YouTube as well. But just really great discussions on basically how AI is being used, how we should think about AI, how we should be framing the discussion, because, some of the sort of bigger, broader talks have been going on about, how is this really impacting people and how do we prepare for the future of this beyond just thinking of it as an enhancement, right? Because it is more than that. I have my own opinions on how fundamentally things are going to change it, but there's no doubt that the change is happening and is going on. And it's just a matter of how we approach it. And we're the ones that are going to have to lead as a business, the people technology interface role that we've become. I have so much sympathy for HR, right? We were told, okay, you're the people, right? You're the ones that really understand people. A lot of people came in through HR through like psychology and social work and, wanting to help people. And they said, okay, now you gotta be data people. Okay, I guess we're data people now, right? You're like, you gotta be running like a business. We need operational business mindset. Okay, so we'll do that. And I was saying, now you gotta be tech people. You gotta understand AI.
Yeah, and now you gotta be AI people. Like we've been saying tech for a while, and now you gotta be AI. Yeah, I think you're right. We ask a lot of the HR leader, right? Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah.
But it just shows how invaluable we all are. Well, maybe not me, but you listeners and viewers. Really, it's interesting. Like I said, we're seeing people move into roles, and we're actually seeing less disruption and less big rifts in the HR sort of
tech space
that we used to see whenever the economies got a little volatile. So I think organizations have realized how indispensable the work we all do. I really hope that continues.
Yeah, and I'll give a little. I have been looking at the early data. It's not the final data, so as I learned a long time ago, the data changes rapidly. But we are not seeing, as much as we're talking a lot about reductions in workforce, I'm still not seeing that show up heavily in the data right now. By industry, yes, but not heavily in the data. So I think, just for everyone out there who's feeling the agita that's going on in the market right now, our data is at least showing that we're still at a pretty positive level from a workforce perspective. That might change, but at least right now. Cliff, if I know we didn't get to the SaaS story with Epic Games, I really wanted to get there because it was local, but we'll get there next week. Anything else before we wrap up today that you want to mention? And otherwise I'll run into our wrap up session.
No, but yeah, I definitely liked seeing that story. Again, that'll be in the notes. But no, it's been really wonderful when we're on the road like this and really getting to see not just what's happening through the news, but getting a kind of glimpse of the future and understanding sort of the mindset of this and hopefully getting that information over to you. It is a lot of work. I know we sort of kicked this whole thing off by making sort of a joke about, we have to get the 4 seasons. Yeah. But it's a very pleasant type of work in that, we're learning this information, we're sharing this information so you can hopefully help make the decisions you need to make to do the best for your organization and your people.
Yeah, it's such an important thing to make sure that the information gets to the right hands, the right place. But as we wrap today, just a big push to one of the best ways to get that information is to take the survey. The survey is open right now, so be sure to go down to the link. It might take you about half an hour, it might take you an hour, but I promise you it is worth it when you get the full paper for anybody who hasn't participated. We also want to note that if you want to participate in future events or want to know where we're going to be at, go sign up at our website for our newsletter that will have all the details that you need to have on a regular basis. Be sure to listen to our sister HR Huddle podcast, HR We Have a Problem, hosted by our CEO, Terry Zipper, found here on the Work Defined environment as well. And then if you'd like to support the podcast, and please subscribe and leave ratings and review where you grab the podcast. As Cliff and I said, we love to hear people tell us that they listen to the show. And then stay up to date with immediate breaking HR tech news and get all the behind the scenes content. You can follow us at Sapient Insights on LinkedIn, as well as Instagram. I'm being told by Allison that I'm going to do more Instagram posting. I'm still trying to figure that out. Anybody wants to do an Instagram class. I'm open to it. All right. Thanks, Clip, for as always, for all the work you do to put all this together. I know it's a lot of work to capture all this together. Thanks to our Brand Method Media Group, who helps us produce the podcast, run by amazing founder Kelly, our marketing team, Summer Orlano, Cole Harris, and Mark Machado. And thanks to our listeners and community. We couldn't do this without you. You are the tea in our cup. Is that a good way to put it? I don't know. You keep us doing this every day. That's it for this episode of Spilling the Tea on HR Tech. We hope it's been just the brew you needed to start the engines running this week. We'll be back in just 2 weeks with another pot of boiling hot HR Tech updates and insights. Bye, everyone.